Well, speaking of China and the U.S. stock market, something that's been happening under the Trump and Biden administration is we've seen more and more Chinese companies get kicked out of the U.S. stock market. Do you think that is a step in the right direction?
I do, and not enough have been. Not enough of them have been put on the entities list or identified in other lists by the Pentagon or the State Department. But it's a start, Chris. What we've seen is Xi starting to try to manipulate his own stock market in such a way as to bring these companies out of ours so that they can't be kicked out of it. It's the old, you can't fire me, I quit kind of angle. Bring them back to China and then sell what are called A shares that are issued on Chinese exchanges back into American markets. A totally unregulated and essentially, flanking maneuver to continue to get those investments coming out of American indexes and the like, despite the fact that we no longer permit them to be operating here, or the Chinese have decided they won't let them be operated there. So what I'm saying is basically this. There's an old expression attributed to Vladimir Lenin, Putin's predecessor. Vladimir Lenin is said to have remarked at one point, the capitalists will sell us the rope with which we will hang them. I don't know if he actually did, but it's certainly a practice that they aspired to. And it's one that has been taken to a whole new level by the Chinese Communist Party. They have figured out that with their engagement with old friends, as they call them, on Wall Street in particular, they will be able to get the capitalists to finance the purchase of the rope with which they will hang us. And this has to stop.
So you think the Trump administration and the Biden administration removing Chinese companies from the U.S. stock market really is just helping China create its own insulated system that's immune to U.S. sanctions?
No, to the contrary. I think it's a necessary step. Don't get me wrong. I think it's long overdue. I wish the Biden team were doing as much as the Trump did and more, because it's required, honestly. We ought to be saying full stop to these investment houses. You are not to invest in our mortal enemy through any of its corporate fronts. It's not acceptable. Don't do it. And if necessary, I would suggest that we designate the Chinese Communist Party as what it is, a transnational criminal organization, which would put every single one of these companies on notice. And by the way, other businesses as well. If you are enabling, aiding, abetting, empowering, all those words I used a moment ago, any of these companies and the CCP itself, you are at risk of being an accomplice to transnational criminal activity. And I think that will help cause many of them to say, we're not going to do it. But here's my point, Chris. If they take these companies back to China and try to raise funds for them through what is essentially a back door, these so-called A shares, that's something we should stop too. And I think that we will have an effect very like that ultimately brought down the last communist, totalitarian communist party and government that sought our destruction, that of the Soviet Union, by really cutting off much of their cash flow.
I mean, the Chinese Communist Party absolutely sees itself at war with the United States. It's an unequal footing that the United States does not consider itself at war with China.
Well, I think one thing that'll be very interesting that's coming up is, and this has to do with that 2013 memorandum you were talking about, Frank, is the SEC is supposed to be ruling pretty soon on whether these companies, these Chinese companies who are allowed to not submit audits to the SEC and other U.S. regulatory organizations, whether they will have to delist for not doing that. And I think this is something that started under the Trump administration, that there started to be pressure on these companies because essentially they were able to, for a while, use auditing firms in China to submit audits. But then the U.S. auditing firms that were operating in China said, we actually can't see a lot of these documents because the Chinese Communist Party considers them state secrets.
No, that was the point of the memorandum of understanding, was to make that kosher, and it obviously isn't. Interestingly, there's another piece of this. I give a lot of credit to Donald Trump for having started saying, not only shouldn't we have this disadvantageous trade with them, and therefore we should be putting tariffs on a lot of these Chinese goods that are being brought to this country, but he also said we oughtn't be underwriting particularly these People's Liberation Army companies. We oughtn't be putting U.S. government personnel, including military personnel's investment funds, their pension funds, into companies building equipment with which to kill them, for example. But there was another step that was really important before the SEC decided that they would take any note of all of this. Both houses of the United States Congress unanimously adopted legislation that said, we're not actually going to allow this to continue, this sweetheart deal and this flim-flam with accounting and non-transparency. The only catch was that they said, we'll give the Chinese companies 3 years to conform, 3 consecutive years, no less, which meant there was all kinds of running room for, playing games with this. It remains to be seen whether the SEC will actually step up to the plate on this. They've sent some, I think, positive signals of late, but they need to end this practice. You either fully meet our accounting standards at a minimum, and more to the point, it seems to me, we should not have companies working for our enemies in our stock market available for capital investments by our investors, most of whom, by the way, are unwittingly having their money put into this purpose.
I do feel like for the average American person, this is something that they feel pretty helpless about. If you have a pension, you do not have any control over how that pension invests their money. It really has to be something that the U.S. government steps in on.
Well, yes and no. I think the government should do it. It's got a responsibility to do it. I mean, again, think about this. What other war have we fought in which we have ignored the fact that our people are helping pay for the other side's involvement in that war? And this may soon become a shooting war, as you sort of indicated at the beginning, Chris. But we've taken an initiative here. It's still early days, truthfully, but our Committee on the Present Danger China, and people can find out more about it at presentdangerchina.org, has begun developing what we call our Mad as Hell campaign. And you remember the old network movie in which the guy gets up and says, I want you to go to the window and I want you to stick your head out and I want you to say, I'm mad as hell and I'm not going to take it anymore. Well, that's how American investors should feel about the fact that, as you say, Shelley, they may think they're helpless, but nonetheless, increasingly they're learning that their money is being used to imperil them, their families, their communities, and their country. And they should be mad as hell about it. We've offered, as an immediate step, just simply a directive to your financial manager. Get my money out of China. The National Security Investment Consultants Institute I mentioned a moment ago is another way to get your investment manager, or your pension fund manager for that matter, equipped to understand it is important to you and important to the country that you invest patriotically, not in our mortal enemy. So this is a work in progress. I encourage our listeners to look for more coming shortly in that regard, but they don't have to feel helpless. They don't need to be helpless. There are pressure points that I think they can use to move the needle, and certainly they ought to be encouraging their government to help them do it.